a black veteran, weary from months of service overseas, finally steps into the airport, ready to return home. But within moments, everything shifts. A security officer eyes him differently, not with the casual indifference given to other travelers, but with suspicion, with doubt, without cause, without reason. The officer stops him, questions him, and then, in front of a growing crowd, humiliates him. But just 7 minutes later, something happens that no one expects. A moment of power shifts. A decision is made, and in an instant, the officer finds himself facing consequences he never anticipated. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events that would be impossible to ignore. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because some stories demand to be told. The cab hummed low against the still night air, its tires pressing soft rhythms into the asphalt as it carried Elijah Freeman toward the airport. He sat in the back, hands folded neatly in his lap, the weight of a lifetime resting on his shoulders. The quiet dignity he had learned to wear like a well-tailored suit had been with him since his youth. But tonight, it felt heavier. Elijah had spent decades mastering the art of being unobtrusive. Not invisible, no. He had seen too much of the world to believe that was ever truly possible for a man like him. But unobtrusive, he had learned that being seen was dangerous. But being too silent was just as damning. It was a balance that he, like so many others, had been forced to perfect. The driver, an older man with weary eyes and the remnants of a New York accent, glanced at Elijah through the rearview mirror. "Are you flying for business or pleasure?" he asked. Elijah smiled. "A small, knowing thing. Neither. Just heading home." The driver nodded but didn't press further. There was a rhythm to these conversations. Small talk that knew its limits. Elijah had played this game before, knowing when to engage and when to let the moment pass. He turned his gaze out the window, watching the city flicker past. A tapestry of neon lights and cracked pavement. The airport loomed ahead, a glass and steel monolith bathed in artificial glow. The cab rolled to a stop, and Elijah stepped out, stretching his legs before slinging his well-worn leather bag over his shoulder. As he approached the entrance, he caught the subtle shift in the posture of the security guard near the doors. A flicker of attention, a moment of calculation. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Elijah had lived too many years to mistake it for anything other than what it was. Inside, the check-in line was smooth, automated. Progress, they called it. A smiling attendant handed him his ticket. First class. A quiet indulgence he had allowed himself after decades of service to a country that had not always served him in return. At the security checkpoint, he placed his bag on the conveyor belt, stepped out of his shoes, and raised his arms when instructed. The agent, a young man, barely in his 20s, paused just a little longer than necessary before waving him through. It was always the same. The pause, the unspoken question, the need to reassure someone, somewhere, that he was not a threat. It was not an accusation. Not exactly, but it was a reminder. By the time he reached the gate, the terminal was alive with the quiet murmur of waiting passengers. He scanned the crowd, a mix of business travelers, families wrangling restless children, and older couples speaking in the hushed tones of familiarity. Boarding was announced, and as he approached the priority line, he felt it again, that flicker of hesitation, that quick up and down assessment from the flight attendant. The moment her eyes met his, he knew. "Sir, are you sure you're in the correct line?" she asked. Polite but firm. Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the handle of his bag. He could have answered her with a smile, with patience, with the weary grace he had been trained to display. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced the boarding pass, holding it up just long enough for her to see the bold first class printed across the top. Her expression didn't shift much. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or mild embarrassment, but not enough to be called regret. "Of course, right this way," she said, stepping aside. He walked past her, his pace measured, his face unreadable. The weight of assumptions followed him onto the plane. Elijah Freeman stepped onto the plane with the quiet confidence of a man who had long learned to carry himself carefully. The cabin was hushed, a cocoon of muted conversations and the subtle rustling of newspapers. As first-class passengers settled into their seats, he moved with deliberate steps, his bag held firmly in his grip, his gaze forward. But even in this sanctuary of comfort, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. A businessman in a pressed navy suit, silver cufflinks glinting under the cabin lights, glanced up from his tablet, his gaze lingering for a beat too long before shifting away. A middle-aged woman, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the light, gave him a polite but wary smile as she clutched her purse just a little tighter against her lap. The flight attendant who had questioned his place in the boarding line was already ahead. Her posture straightener now, as if readying herself for another misstep. Elijah knew this script well. He had lived it. He had felt it in hotel lobbies, in upscale restaurants, in the silent challenge of doormen who asked, with their narrowed eyes, whether he belonged. He had learned, long ago, that first class was not just a seat. It was a statement. As he slid into his seat, arranging his bag beneath his feet, the flight attendant approached. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass again?" Elijah exhaled through his nose. Slow and steady, he turned his head, meeting her gaze, not with hostility, not with anger, but with something deeper, a patience that was older than both of them. "You've already seen it," he said, voice smooth, steady. She hesitated, just for a second, then, as if realizing she had nowhere else to go, she nodded and murmured, "Of course." She walked away. He adjusted his seatbelt and let his gaze drift to the window, watching as the world outside blurred with the movement of airport ground crews. He had fought wars for this country. He had carried its weight on his back. And still, at every turn, he was asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" The tension in his shoulders did not ease, but he knew better than to expect it to. Minutes passed. Passengers shuffled in, and soon, the cabin was full. The seat beside him remained empty for longer than expected. Until at last, a man arrived. An older gentleman, white-haired, wearing the quiet affluence of those who never had to think twice about the spaces they occupied. Elijah nodded politely as the man settled in, folding his jacket carefully before placing his briefcase beneath the seat. There was a moment of stillness between them, an unspoken calculation. Then, the man spoke. "You military?" Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. It wasn't an unusual question. The way he carried himself, the quiet discipline, the measured stillness, it was the kind of thing people noticed. "Yes," Elijah said. The man gave a knowing nod. But something in his expression shifted, like he was searching for the right words, or deciding whether to say them at all. "My father served in World War II," the man said. "Always taught me to respect the uniform." Elijah let the words settle. They were meant as a bridge, an attempt to find common ground. But there was something underneath them, something unfinished. Then he must have known. Elijah said, "That respect isn't always given freely." The older man hesitated. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his face. And then, perhaps as a way to redirect the moment, he extended his hand. "William Monroe," he said. Elijah shook it, firm but not forceful. "Elijah Freeman." The exchange was brief, but in that clasp of hands, there was a quiet recognition of different lives, of different battles fought. Some on fields of war, others on the streets of home. The flight attendant returned, moving down the aisle with a practiced smile, offering drinks to the passengers. When she reached Elijah's row, she looked to William first. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" Elijah watched. He waited. William glanced at Elijah, then back at the attendant. "He was here before me," he said, his voice even. "You should ask him first." The flight attendant blinked, hesitated just long enough for the moment to stretch between them. Then, slowly, she turned. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" Elijah did not smile. He did not offer her an easy way out. "I'll have a coffee," he said. The moment passed. But the lesson? He hoped she would carry it with her. The plane began its slow taxi to the runway, and Elijah leaned back into his seat, the hum of the engines vibrating beneath his ribs. The weight of assumptions still lingered in the air. But for the first time that night, it was not his burden alone to carry. The plane lifted off the ground, the weight of Earth falling away beneath them. But Elijah Freeman knew better than to think that gravity had loosened its grip. Some burdens, after all, stayed with you no matter how high you climbed. The first-class cabin settled into its quiet rhythm. Drinks poured, murmured conversations, the rustling of newspapers and the soft clicks of polished nails tapping against phone screens. He watched the flight attendant move efficiently through the aisles, her smile carefully measured as she tended to passengers. She had not met his eyes since their last exchange. William Monroe, his seatmate, had settled in as well. He had opened a book, something thick and worn, but Elijah noticed he had yet to turn the page. They were both waiting. It did not take long. A new presence loomed in the aisle. A different flight attendant this time. A man, young and rigid in his uniform. His smile, when it came, was practiced but thin, stretched over something uncertain. "Sir," he said, voice pitched just low enough to seem polite. "I need to verify your seat assignment." Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Here we go again." Slowly, he turned his head, meeting the young man's gaze. "You need to verify my seat assignment?" The flight attendant hesitated but nodded. "Yes, sir. If I could just see your boarding pass." William Monroe shifted beside him, his book forgotten now. The silence around them thickened, subtle but present, passengers pretending not to listen but hearing every word. Elijah exhaled, measured and slow. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and retrieved the boarding pass, the crisp print of first class standing out against the paper. He held it up, not handing it over just yet. "Tell me something," he said, his voice quiet but edged with something that could cut if needed. "Did you ask anyone else in this cabin to verify their seat?" The young man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing just slightly. Don't rush your answer," Elijah said. He was calm, too calm. He had been here before. In this moment, in 1,000 variations of it. Just think about it. A pause. The young man glanced at the other flight attendant. The woman from before, the one who had questioned Elijah at boarding. She looked away quickly. Elijah smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. "You and I both know the answer, don't we?" A cough, a shuffle in a nearby seat. The tension had wrapped itself around the cabin now. Unavoidable, undeniable. "Sir," the young man said, shifting on his feet. "It's just a routine check." "A routine check," Elijah repeated, rolling the words over in his mouth like he was testing their weight. "A routine check, but only for me?" William Monroe, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. "Enough of this," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never had to explain his place in the world. "He showed you his boarding pass. Let the man be." The young flight attendant hesitated again, then nodded stiffly. "Of course," he said, but Elijah heard what was really in his voice. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, just discomfort, just the hope that this moment would end. The young man walked away, and Elijah leaned back into his seat, sliding the boarding pass back into his pocket. The air around him was thick with something unspoken, something old and tired. William exhaled beside him. "That was ridiculous." Elijah chuckled, low and bitter. "That was Tuesday." William turned his head, looking at him fully now. "This happened to you often?" Elijah met his gaze. "How often do you get asked to prove you belong somewhere?" William blinked, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Elijah nodded, as if that was answer enough. The rest of the flight continued, the rhythm of first class returning. But the weight of what had happened did not fade. It never did. He had won the moment, if you could even call it that. But the fight? The fight was far from over. The plane had leveled out now, its engines humming a steady rhythm against the stillness of the cabin. The air was warm, thick with the scent of stale coffee and leather seats. The muffled clinking of glasses from the galley. But in the space around Elijah Freeman, something else lingered, a quiet tension, a murmur beneath the surface, like the low rumble of a coming storm. William Monroe had gone back to his book, but Elijah knew the man wasn't reading. The silence between them wasn't just thoughtful. It was heavy, The kind of silence that comes when a man is forced to see something he never had to see before. Elijah let his eyes drift down the aisle, where the flight attendants had retreated into their small spaces of authority. The young man who had demanded his boarding pass stood near the galley, speaking to the first attendant. The woman who had questioned his right to be here before he ever set foot on the plane. Their heads were close, their voices low, and Elijah knew what was coming before it ever arrived. It came in the form of another man. A different kind of uniform this time. A senior flight attendant, his epaulets marking him as the one who carried final authority in this floating world above the clouds. He walked with a kind of certainty Elijah recognized. It was the certainty of a man who believed in rules, in order, in the quiet enforcement of the way things are supposed to be. Mr. Freeman? The attendant's voice was polite. Too polite. Elijah turned his head slowly, meeting the man's eyes with something unreadable. That's me. I wanted to check in with you. The man said. Is everything all right? A question that wasn't a question. Elijah let the words settle before answering. I imagine it depends on what you mean by, all right. The attendant offered a small, rehearsed smile. I was told there was a concern regarding your seat assignment. Just making sure everything is in order. The weight of the moment balanced between them. Delicate. Dangerous. Elijah tilted his head slightly. You're asking me if everything is in order. But the real question is, who, exactly, has a concern? Because it isn't me. A flicker of hesitation. The flight attendant shifted slightly, his polished shoes squeaking against the carpet. Sir, we just want to ensure that all our passengers are comfortable. Comfortable, Elijah echoed, letting the words stretch between them. And am I making someone uncomfortable? The man hesitated, and there it was. Elijah exhaled, slow and measured. He had spent a lifetime watching people like this dance around their intentions, carefully wrapping their words in civility, dressing up old prejudices in the language of policy and protocol. The flight attendant cleared his throat. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let us know. And then, just like that, he was gone. Elijah sat back in his seat, pressing his fingers against the armrest. He could feel William watching him, the weight of his gaze thick with something that might have been guilt, or discomfort, or maybe just realization. After a long moment, the older man spoke. They keep checking on you, but not in the way that means they actually care. Huh? Elijah let out a small, humorless chuckle. Something like that. William sighed. I've flown first class more times than I can count, he said, shaking his head. And I've never had anyone question my ticket. Not once. Elijah turned to him, his expression calm but steady. You were never expected to prove you belonged. The words landed, sinking into the space between them. William exhaled, looking down at his hands, the book in his lap forgotten. I suppose that's true. Elijah looked away, back out the window, where the clouds stretched endless and white beneath them. He had long since stopped expecting the world to be fair. But fairness was never the point. The point was survival. The point was knowing that, even up here, miles above the earth, the weight of history still followed him. Even in the sky, some rules never changed. The air inside the first-class cabin had grown heavier, thick with something unspoken. It was in the glances, the pauses, the careful avoidance of eyes. Elijah Freeman knew this feeling well. It was not anger, not outright hostility, but something quieter, more insidious. The discomfort of the privileged when made to confront the rules they do not see but benefit from all the same. The senior flight attendant had disappeared back down the aisle, but the air around Elijah still carried the aftershocks of the exchange. He had long since learned that moments like these did not end when the conversation did. No, they lingered. They sat in the air like smoke from an old fire, seeping into the bones of a place, into the bones of a man. William Monroe cleared his throat beside him, shifting slightly in his seat. He had been silent for a long time now, and Elijah could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing against the man's lips. Finally, William spoke. You think they'll leave you alone now? Elijah let out a soft, humorless chuckle. I think that depends on what they decide I am. William frowned, tilting his head. What do you mean? Elijah turned slightly, meeting the man's gaze with something steady, something knowing. Men like me are always made to be something. A problem, a mistake, a curiosity. He exhaled slowly. Or a threat. William said nothing at first. His fingers traced the edges of his book, though he had long since stopped pretending to read it. You're not a threat, he said finally, but there was something hesitant in the way he said it, as if the very act of needing to say it made him realize something he had never considered before. Elijah smiled, small and sharp. You didn't need to tell me that. William swallowed and looked away. Elijah settled back into his seat. The hum of the engines pressed against his skin. The plane steady in the air. But still, he could not shake the feeling of something circling. Something waiting. He didn't have to wait long. A woman, a passenger from a few rows ahead, had risen from her seat. She was in her mid-50s, well-dressed in a way that spoke to old money rather than new. Her pearl necklace resting neatly against the collar of her blouse. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle as she made her way toward the galley. Elijah did not turn his head. But he didn't need to. He heard the shift in conversation as soon as she reached the attendants. The hushed murmurs, the way voices dropped just slightly. He had been alive too long to mistake the tone. It was a complaint. And he already knew who it was about. The young flight attendant, the one who had demanded to see Elijah's boarding pass earlier, nodded as the woman spoke. His posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't making a scene. But her voice carried the quiet entitlement of a person who had never had to shout to be heard. A few minutes later, the senior attendant was back. Elijah did not sign, did not roll his eyes. He only lifted his gaze, already resigned to whatever fresh indignity they were about to dress up as procedure. Mr. Freeman, the attendant said, his tone still polite, still rehearsed. I wanted to check in one last time. Make sure you're comfortable. Elijah studied him. I was. Until you walked over. The attendant's jaw tightened slightly. But he did not break his practiced smile. I understand, he said. A lie. But I do need to ask one more thing. Here it comes. There's been a concern about your presence in this cabin. The attendant said, carefully choosing his words. And I want to ensure all of our passengers have the best possible experience. Elijah stared at him, slow and deliberate. A concern. Yes. Do I look concerned to you? The attendant hesitated. No, sir. Then it seems the concern is not mine. The flight attendant shifted, clearly uncomfortable now. He exhaled quietly before lowering his voice even further. Mr. Freeman, we have a few open seats in business class. If you'd prefer. Quote. Elijah let out a low chuckle. A deep, quiet thing that carried no humor. Ah, he said, tilting his head slightly. So that's what this is. William Monroe stiffened beside him. His book forgotten completely now. His hands were clenched into loose fists in his lap. I assure you, sir, this is only a suggestion. The attendant continued. Elijah shook his head, his smile never faltering. No, son. What this is a request. He let his voice drop. Just slightly, into something sharper, but not a request for my comfort. The flight attendant opened his mouth, then closed it again. William Monroe shifted in his seat, inhaled as if he was about to say something. But Elijah was already ahead of him. Let me make something clear, Elijah said, his voice smooth, deliberate. I paid for this seat. I boarded this plane the same way as every other first-class passenger. And I will remain in this seat. Not because you allow it. Not because you offer me an alternative, but because I belong here. Your discomfort does not change that. Nor does hers. He flicked his gaze briefly toward the woman who had lodged the complaint. She was staring now, stiff in her seat, but she did not look away. The senior attendant swallowed. The power in the conversation had shifted. And he knew it. Of course, sir, he said after a moment. If there's anything else we can do for you. Quote. Elijah smiled, slow and knowing. You can let me drink my coffee in peace. The man gave a stiff nod before retreating back to the galley. The plane was silent for a long moment. A silence that stretched, that thickened, that carried something deeper than mere awkwardness. Finally, William Monroe turned to him. His voice was quieter now. A little heavier. They really were going to move you. weren't they? Elijah exhaled through his nose. They were going to ask. William shook his head, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he spoke again, his voice lower. You know, I always thought things had gotten better. Elijah turned to him, studying his face, his hesitation, the weight of old beliefs breaking under the force of new truths. And then he smiled, tired, knowing. You thought wrong. The cabin was quiet now. But not in the way of peace. No, this was the silence of something left unfinished. The air still carried the weight of what had just passed. Of the flight attendant's retreat. Of the woman who had whispered her complaints but now sat stiffly in her seat. Pretending that she had not just tried to erase a man from a place he had paid to be. Elijah Freeman had won this round. If it could even be called a victory. But victories like these always cost something. He took a slow sip of his coffee, now lukewarm, and placed it carefully on the tray before him. Across the aisle, the woman with the pearls still glanced at him, her eyes darting back to her magazine whenever she thought he might notice. William Monroe sat beside him, hands folded over the book in his lap. But he hadn't turned a page in at least 10 minutes. It was William who finally broke the silence. They could have handled that differently, he murmured. Elijah exhaled through his nose. Could they have? William frowned. I mean, he hesitated, looking down at his hands. I don't know. Maybe they were just trying to keep the peace. Elijah turned his head slowly, looking at him fully. And tell me, William, when exactly did my removal become the price of peace? William said nothing. Elijah didn't press him. The man was grappling with something. Struggling with an understanding that was clawing its way into him whether he was ready or not. And Elijah had lived long enough to know that when men like William Monroe finally saw what had always been there, they often didn't know what to do with it. The flight continued. A few minutes later, the woman with the pearls stood up from her seat and made her way toward the restroom. As she passed, she glanced at Elijah again. Just for a second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. And then, just as quickly, she turned away, her footsteps clipped and sharp against the carpet. William let out a low breath. You think she'll complain again? Elijah chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. Not out loud. They both knew how this worked. The woman had lost, and people like her did not take losing well. But instead of fighting, she would retreat into something just as familiar. Just as old. She would sit in her seat and feel wronged. Feel that she had been the one disrespected. The one made to endure something unfair. She would not say it outright. Not in words. Not in ways that could be challenged. But she would carry it. And that, in many ways, was even worse. Because people like her never carried their grievances alone. Somewhere, someday, someone else would pay the price for what had happened today. Elijah had seen it before. A woman like her would return home to her world. And maybe it wouldn't be that day. Maybe not even that week. But eventually, something small would set her off. Maybe she'd see a young black boy walking too close to her straight. Maybe she'd clutch her purse a little tighter when a black man entered an elevator. Maybe she'd refuse to tip a waitress who reminded her, just vaguely, of Elijah Freeman sitting in seat 3A. And she would think she was justified. Elijah had lived long enough to know that the worst racism was never the loud kind. No, it was this. It was grievance turned into quiet punishment. Turned into policy. Turned into law. The weight of that thought settled in his chest. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved through the aisles. Collecting empty glasses. Murmuring polite nothings to the passengers. The world of first class had reset itself. Pretended to return to normal. But Elijah knew better. Normal had never been built for him. Mr. Freeman? He looked up. The young flight attendant, the one who had first asked for his boarding pass, stood there again, shifting slightly on his feet. He looked uncomfortable, not in the way of a man with power, but in the way of a man who had just realized he had been used. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Yes? The young man hesitated, then cleared his throat. I just wanted to apologize. For earlier. Elijah tilted his head slightly. And what, exactly, are you apologizing for? The flight attendant hesitated again. I didn't mean anything by it. The check. I was just following. He stopped himself before saying orders. because even he knew how hollow that sounded. Elijah let the moment stretch. Then he leaned forward slightly. His voice quiet, steady. Do you know what happens when a man spends his whole life being questioned? The young man blinked. Sir? Elijah held his gaze. He learns to expect it. He learns to anticipate the moment when someone will come along and make him prove once again that he deserves the space he is in. And that, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head, that is the real tragedy of it all. The young man swallowed, looking down for a second. Then, quietly, he nodded. I understand. Elijah studied him, then let out a small sigh. No, son, he said, leaning back. You don't. And then the young man left. William Monroe let out a long breath beside him, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn, he muttered. Elijah only chuckled. The world was slow to change. But he had never expected it to change at all. The plane sailed through the night sky, miles above the world, but the weight pressing down on Elijah Freeman was heavier than the altitude. The young flight attendant had retreated, leaving behind the awkward imprint of a man who had only just begun to understand the machine he was a part of. And perhaps that was the real cruelty of it all. Understanding came too late, always too late. It came when the damage had already been done, when the decision had already been made, when the quiet gears of discrimination had already turned in their well-oiled precision. Elijah had seen men like that before. Boys, really, who found themselves caught between the comfort of their ignorance and the burden of awareness. But awareness was not atonement. Awareness would not unmake the years, the centuries, of quiet, complicated compliance. William Monroe had been silent for some time now. Elijah let him sit in that silence. Let him stew in it. He had no interest in saving this man from his discomfort. No desire to make it easier for him to reckon with what had unfolded. The truth was this. William Monroe had always known. He had always been aware of the rules of the world they both lived in. He had just never had to acknowledge them before. Not like this. Not so plainly. But acknowledgement was not the same as experience. And that was what separated them. The flight had settled into its rhythm again. Passengers shifting under the thin blankets. The quiet murmuring of attendants in the galley. The occasional cough breaking the hush of the cabin. But then came something unexpected. The woman with the pearls. She had returned from the restroom. But instead of slipping back into her seat, she hesitated, just for a second. Then, before Elijah could react, she stepped toward him, stopping just beside his row. A few passengers noticed, eyes flicking upward, their curiosity quiet but present. Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. He expected anger, resentment, some desperate, final attempt to reclaim whatever power she thought she had lost in their earlier exchange. But what he saw instead was something more fragile. Doubt. She inhaled sharply, as if preparing to speak. But then, in the span of a breath, she reconsidered. Instead of words, she merely nodded once, a stiff, uncertain gesture, before returning to her seat. And Elijah understood. She had wanted to say something. Maybe I even needed to say something. But she had not yet decided what. William exhaled beside him. What the hell was that? Elijah smirked. That was someone realizing she's not the hero of her own story. William let out a soft laugh. Not one of amusement, but of understanding. And what does that make you? Elijah turned to the window, gazing out at the endless stretch of darkness. Just a man trying to get home. Silence again. But this time, something had shifted. It wasn't that the plane was different. It wasn't that the people in first class had suddenly seen him. Truly seen him, as something more than an anomaly. More than a disruption to their smooth, curated world. No, that would be asking for too much. What had changed was something smaller, subtler. An awareness had settled in the air. Not loud enough to be called revolution. Not sharp enough to be called confrontation. But present nonetheless. A disruption. A crack in the foundation. And cracks, Elijah knew, had a way of spreading. The flight continued. The world below remained as it was. But up here, in the silence of the sky, something had shifted. And perhaps, for now, that was enough. The descent had begun. The plane tilting ever so slightly. the hum of the engines shifting as they prepared to return to solid ground. Elijah Freeman felt the familiar pressure in his ears, the subtle shift in gravity. But the weight on his shoulders had nothing to do with altitude. The night outside the window was vast, endless, a sea of darkness broken only by the distant glow of a city waiting below. Somewhere down there, the world continued as it always had. Relentless, indifferent, unchanged. The people on this plane would step off, stretch their legs, shake the stiffness from their bodies, and fold themselves back into their lives as if nothing had happened. And maybe, for most of them, nothing had. But for others, something had taken root. William Monroe had not opened his book again. He sat with his hands clasped together, staring straight ahead, as if still working through something he wasn't sure he had the words for. The woman with the pearls had stopped glancing in Elijah's direction. But her posture had changed. Less stiff, less certain of herself. Elijah knew this kind of silence. It was the silence that came when people realized they could no longer unsee what had been laid before them. The voice of the captain crackled overhead, announcing their approach. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, collecting trash, straightening blankets, and securing the space for landing. The young attendant, the one who had asked for Elijah's boarding pass, the one who had come back with a quiet apology, paused at Elijah's row, looking as if he wanted to say something more. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, brief but intentional, before moving on. The plane lowered further, and the runway lights stretched into focus below. Elijah exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against the armrest. It was almost over. The tires touched down with a gentle jolt, the engines roaring as the plane slowed, pulling them all back into the world they had left behind hours ago. Passengers began shifting in their seats, impatient to disembark. Bags were reached for, coats shrugged on, and then, like clockwork, the hierarchy of travel reasserted itself. First-class passengers gathered their belongings at an unhurried pace while those in economy waited their turn. Elijah remained seated for a moment, letting the crowd move around him. He had no need to rush. William Monroe stood, grabbing his briefcase, but then hesitated. He turned slightly, looking down at Elijah. "You know," he said after a beat. "I never really thought about it before. Not like this." Elijah tilted his head. "And what exactly is this?" William let out a slow breath. "The way things are. The way they've always been." He shifted his grip on his briefcase. "You said I was never expected to prove I belonged. I think I finally understand what you meant." Elijah studied him, then offered a small, tired smile. "You understand it today. But the real question is, will you still understand it tomorrow?" William had no answer for that. Not yet. He gave a small nod and stepped into the aisle, disappearing into the slow-moving crowd. Elijah waited a moment longer before rising. Stretching his limbs, he reached for his bag. But before he left his seat, he did something he hadn't planned to. He pulled a pen from his pocket, tore a page from the airline's complimentary notepad, and began to write. "To whomever reads this, you asked me once if I was comfortable. You asked if I was all right. You asked, but what you really meant was, are you going to make this easy for us? Are you going to let us continue pretending? I was never meant to be comfortable. And neither were you. The question you should be asking is whether you're comfortable with that." He folded the note carefully, slipping it into the small pocket on the seat in front of him. Then, with the quiet dignity of a man who had long since stopped asking for permission, he walked off the plane. The world outside was waiting.